Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for joining this session that is about what works to span science policy boundaries in international Geneva. That's a session that's part of the Science Diplomacy Week, for which you may have or will attend other sessions. My name is Nicolas Seidler. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Science Policy Interface. The GSPI is a platform that which mission is to be a full-time actor that supports the engagement between academic actors and policy actors from the international Geneva ecosystem. And the work we do is really to based on the assumption that more regular, more intensified, and sort of better quality interactions between those communities can actually lead to more impactful evidence-based or evidence-informed policies. Today, we will delve into the role of science for global policy, and more specifically on the role that people play in spanning boundaries between science and policy. So we are going to really focus on the people who work on that spectrum from knowledge production to collective action. And in the work that the GSPI does, that's really an element that we've observed as being really critical for the success of or failure of science policy collaborations. I should mention that we will use the term global policy as a wider term that includes diplomacy, but also practices related to policy design, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. Science for global policy is a topic that's been and that is still extensively discussed. To give you a few examples, that refers, for example, to lessons from COVID-19 related to which science should inform pandemic preparedness and response, how to build science policy task forces as well, for example. It relates to the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, which calls for a UN 2.0 based on science and which calls for international policies to follow evidence and be result-oriented. It refers to the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which Secretariat is next door, which just released its newest report, which synthesizes climate science to support policymaking. And it also relates to where we are, Switzerland, which has placed science at the very core of its host state strategy that's part of the foreign policy objectives. So I think it's fair to say and fairly clear that using science in global policy is on the agenda. It's a shared goal. And I think that the question, therefore, is not so much why we need science for policy, but actually to focus on the how. And that's because even if we care about using science for global policy, we often fail to do so. We have sometimes believed too much that science would solve politics. And there are various reasons for those misfits between science and policy, some which are more systemic, but we think it's very important to actually also focus on the relationship level between scientists and policymakers. And so some of the questions that we'll cover today in this session include how can we make progress on the practices that foster the use of science in global policy? What is the individual reality of the people who work at the interface between the two? And what are the set of skills, knowledge, and practices that actors develop to span science policy boundaries? So we have a fantastic panel today, which I'll introduce in sequence to help us navigate those questions. Before we start getting into the substance, just two housekeeping issues. We'll take some pictures during this event. In case you have any objections or would like not to appear on those pictures, please let my colleague Christina know at the end of the session. She's there at the back. And lastly, we'll have some opportunity for drinks at the end of this session. So feel free to stay around and mingle after the panel. So to introduce this session, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Maxime Stauffer, who will provide some framing remarks on some of the concepts that we want to discuss today. Maxime is a senior science policy officer at the GSPI. He has worked and written on evidence-based policymaking, risk governance, as well as on decision-making under uncertainty. He was previously a researcher at actually the Graduate Institute here and an advisor to the European Commission's Joint Research Center. So, Maxime, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Can you hear me well? Seems like it. Great. All right, so I'm going to briefly talk about spanning boundaries between science and policy in the context of international Geneva. And the reason why I'm giving this keynote, but also the reason why we have this session, is not like because we need to talk about why we need science in policy, but because we need to kind of think a bit further about the relationship between science and policy, and further than what we have actually done in the past. To just give you an example, you've probably heard of this. So the IPCC that is next door provides this like synthesis report of the state of the art on climate science. This synthesis report is targeted at policymakers. It answers some policy needs, some policy questions. And it's really kind of like almost like the best example of the summary of evidence we can have on a policy relevant topic. And this is the picture of the recent briefing that the IPCC experts gave to the Swiss Parliament 2 weeks ago. And this briefing was not attended or boycotted by 2/3 of the Assembly. And that basically gives a sign. It can give a sign to citizens to perhaps elect different people at the next election. But it is also a sign that information is essentially not enough. We can have the best information possible. We can have the best evidence, the best synthesis done directly for policymakers. It is not sufficient to actually have policy change in light of the evidence. Policy change essentially does not respond proportionally to the information that we bombard policymakers with. And that essentially begs the question of how can we better conceptualize this relationship between science and policy, and then how can we actually make progress? So the goal is essentially to think about how science can be useful for policy, how policymakers can better use science, of course. And the other question is how science can actually maybe follow policy needs. So how policy can actually inform scientific objectives. And whether this mutually beneficial relationship happens depends on this black box that is between science and policy. And in this black box, there are many, many things, processes, networks, and so on. And there are many ways to unpack this black box. And one way to unpack this black box is to look into this and see networks of individuals. At the end of the day, in academic institutions or governments or international organizations, what we see are beyond chairs and tables and microphones, essentially individuals that have beliefs, that make decisions individually or collectively. And then in these decisions, they use science to some extent, to a large extent, or not at all, or they may even misuse science. And the point of kind of this session is to look at this individual nature of the science policy interface and explore how we can actually do better. So if we zoom into these networks of individuals, we have networks of scientific actors, we have networks of policy actors, and of course they overlap pretty significantly. And if we think about a scientist that works in academia, the scientist, in order to influence policy, has to navigate scientific networks, academic constraints, distills policy insights from his own research, and navigate all the way to policy actors, find politicians or civil servants that want to listen to this scientific knowledge, and perhaps at some point realize that the scientist must change its own vocabulary or approach to policymaking or research directions. Conversely, if we think about a policy actor engagement with science, whether this is a civil servant or a diplomat, this policy actor needs to think, oh, what are the questions I have for which science can be useful? I need to unpack this. I then need to look for scientific experts that can actually respond to these questions, find the good ones, find the ones I trust, the ones that are available. This can take time. And then by the time we have them, maybe these actors will provide relevant insights, but maybe they might be a bit off, they might be off topic, and so on. And that will be like a continuous process of refinement between scientists' engagement and policy actors' engagement. And the point is that there are other actors. There are intermediary actors, actors that actually have networks on both sides, whose job is to know the scientific reality and the policy reality, to speak the languages of both sides, and then to connect the networks of science and of policy. And these intermediary actors essentially are called boundary spanners. So because that's what they do. They span boundaries between science and policy, the boundaries of the cultural aspects of science and policy, but also the networks, the objectives, the priorities of these two kind of big social spheres. So the question is, who are they? What do they do? So these boundary spanners, they can be individuals or organizations. They can be in academia. They can be in policy or in between. They can be just individuals in centers, in departments. But they can also be organizations that specifically tries to bridge science and policy. They work at the interface, precisely. That's what characterizes their profession. They're sometimes full-time on this work. Sometimes it's their profession to actually distill scientific knowledge into policy or distill policy needs into research questions. But often these actors are not full-time. Often it's an ad hoc thing they do on the side of their job, something they want to grow a bit more, but they don't have the time to do. They centralize the skills, networks, and resources to actually make progress on working at the interface. Having these skills and resources is something that is different from the usual profession that they would have either on the scientific side or on the policy side. So that's something that sets them apart. And they work for the long term. They don't only work on an ad hoc basis between science and policy, but they engage continuously, and they foster continuous trust. They foster continuous engagement between these both spheres. So what do they do precisely? So there are 6 kind of domains of activities. One is that they build networks in academia and policy. They connect experts and end users. They foster collaborations. They can speed up the rate at which collaborations can be created. They foster trust between both sides. A second thing is that they foster exchanges. So once people are in the room, people are identified, they foster information flows, make sure that people understand each other. They organize space for dialogue. They translate knowledge and needs. Thirdly, they also enhance research relevance. So they can identify and communicate policy needs, translate them into research questions, research priorities. They can encourage knowledge co-creation, make sure that when research directions are defined, then researchers and policymakers are actually in the room together defining the research priorities. They can also identify relevant outputs, because spanning science and policy boundaries is not about producing policy-relevant academic papers. It's about producing also outputs that can speak to policy actors, which can be digital tools, which can be in-person briefings, can be interviews, podcasts, and so on. So it's really trying to go beyond the standard academic information input that we know. They leverage windows of opportunity, so they engage in specific policy contexts. They monitor policy activity. They try to anticipate what is going to happen, which topics are going to be discussed, and how. And by doing that, they collect what is called tacit knowledge, this knowledge that is not published anywhere, that you cannot know about if you don't engage in policy networks. And by collecting this knowledge, they can basically inform scientists on which research should be done when and by which time. And they can also inform how maybe research can be framed and presented such that it speaks to the people that will negotiate or make decisions. They work on building capacity. They engage in multiple collaborations at once. they draw lessons learned over time, they can always kind of like professionalize the sphere, and they foster sustainability. As I said, they work for the long term, they will be there over time, they will foster continuous engagement. So that's broadly what these sets of factors do. Now the question is, what does that mean in Geneva? So as you know, Geneva is a vibrant ecosystem for international policy. There are many, many opportunities for science to contribute to policy. You have essentially the equivalent of the Genevan population that attends policy meetings in Geneva. So it's a very dense network in terms of like policy activity. And because it's a dense network, you have many institutions, entities that work on these issues. So going back to this like network view of boundary spanning, Geneva is essentially like an ideal ecosystem for science policy boundary spanning, because you have many actors, and if you're in this network, you can actually work on connecting these different people to make progress. It is ideal, yes, but the problem is when we engage in international Geneva, it often feels like this. It often feels like walking in fog, when we can do one step at a time and we need to learn from failures. And this is because a lot of things that happen in Geneva are tacit. Not all the processes are published. We cannot anticipate everything and reverse engineer the research that needs to be conducted. And therefore, the boundary spanners in Geneva, they need to have extra competences. They need to know the processes of many international organizations, the potential of important member states on certain questions in order to develop good framings of research. And this is all good and well, and this is something that is learned mostly by doing, as we will probably listen in a bit. But there's a problem with this, is that the opacity and the complexity of an ecosystem like Geneva excludes external actors. If researchers want to engage with international Geneva, it is very hard to navigate. It is very hard to know who to talk to, when, and where. And the problem is that many of these external actors are scientists, are researchers. And therefore, it's hard for scientists, beyond maybe the ones that are based in Geneva, to know what's going on in Geneva and to actually contribute. So in order to make progress, essentially, the vision is that we want better policies through science. And for that, we need science and policy to inform each other. The point of this session is that for this to succeed, we need more boundary spanners, more people that actually work at the interface that can understand both sides and link scientists and policymakers. But for them to exist, we need incentives, opportunities, resources, and connections to validate their profession, to motivate them, to make sure that their engagement is sustained over time. And for that, we also need like a common language and a community of practice. And this theory of change is essentially what the Geneva Science Policy Interface tries to do with its own activities, try to foster a network of practice that can foster professional boundary spanning in international Geneva. So all of this is good and well, of course, but science and policy interface is not new in Geneva. There are decades of practices. So we need to learn from what exists, and we should not reinvent the wheel. So what we've done in the past years is that we investigated about like 156 science policy mechanisms in international Geneva to look at what actually exists. So here's like some of the findings. So we've seen that 2/3 of what we found are actually initiated by international organizations and not academic institutions. So international organizations are willing to consume science, and they're willing to set up mechanisms to interface with science. Secondly, many of these mechanisms have an international focus. A few have like a lower focus, regional or national, but many of them seek to have a global impact. In terms of mechanisms, we found many different kind of specific types of activities, from publications to support policy, like policy briefs, events to inform policy, the setup of expert groups, the development of tools to support policy, trainings to help policymakers understand evidence, some calls for scientific support, building networks and partnerships, or data collection efforts, and so on. In terms of direction, most of these mechanisms focus on research to policy, and that's quite logical. But a minority of mechanisms try to look at the two-way transfer, trying to distill policy needs into research directions. In terms of temporality, we found that 2/3 of these mechanisms are actually quite ad hoc and discrete. They're not meant to last over time. They're meant to exist for a given period of time. And maybe that's something that we actually want to change. We want to have continuous processes to foster science policy engagement. In terms of goals, we have a variety of them, from enhanced policy-making impact to actually enhancing the science policy ecosystem in Geneva, to a better access to information, to like improve data ecologies. So how data is collected, translated into policy advice, and used in decision making. So like this is a snapshot that is not exhaustive, of course. Maybe it's a bit representative of what already exists in Geneva. There's already a lot we can build upon. And the point of this session is that behind these mechanisms, there are actually people that initiated them, that thought that these things were actually strategic to do, and they had reasons to set them up. And by doing that, they learn many things. They learn practices and competences on spanning boundaries between science and policy. And one of the next steps for the Geneva Science Policy Interface is to actually interview these people, survey these people, to know how they navigate science and policy in Geneva, such that then we can actually create a community of practice to foster science policy engagement. And next, we'll have a panel actually of like 3 people in Geneva that have engaged between science and policy that can share their experience. And that's a way for us to get us started. So I think that's all. And thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Maxime. I think you've laid out very useful concepts and notions for the discussion today, so thank you very much. And definitely many elements that we'll get back to. And so now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Marie McAuliffe. Marie is the head of the Migration Research and Publications Division at IOM, that's the UN Agency on Migrations, headquartered in Geneva. She's also the editor of the World Migration Report. That's a flagship annual report from IOM. She's an international migration specialist with more than 20 years of experience in migration as a practitioner, program manager, as well as senior official and researcher. So, Marie, in your work leading the development of the World Migration Report, you obviously spend a lot of time bringing in and sort of translating science and evidence to make it available and sort of accessible to decision makers that take sort of key decisions on migrations, and obviously that impacts people's lives as well. So first of all, I wanted to ask you a more personal question, which is how does one become an intermediary between science and policy actors, and what does it take for an individual to perform such a role?
Thank you very much. And let me just start by saying thank you for this event, and also, Maxime, for your introduction. It resonated very strongly. It's really important to be doing these types of events, sharing knowledge, sharing mistakes, sharing how we learn, how we engage. And so I'm really appreciative to GSPI and the Graduate Institute, of course, for hosting this event in Science Diplomacy Week. Very important discussions. I kind of feel a little, I guess, surprised in some ways that I've been invited, but delighted as well to share insights. I've been working in migration for a very long time and started as a visa officer. I'm essentially just a glorified visa officer in my current role, to be honest, working overseas for the Australian government, running programmatic kind of areas, working in policy, then working in academia. So I have started off with a very strong, I guess, focus on migration and international migration and displacement in particular. In terms of your particular question, I think that from a personal perspective, focusing on the contents and the quality is first and foremost the most important thing. I think it's the same for all so-called boundary spanners. We don't really belong anywhere, and we belong everywhere in some respects. It's about focusing on professional and technical competence and being willing to defend that in different quarters and expands the opportunities. So a lot of what Maxime talked about earlier very strongly resonated, but there are a lot of obstacles in terms of trying to achieve that. When you talked about the discrete initiatives, I immediately thought of funding, and we had a discussion earlier on the challenges in relation to funding. But always focusing on quality enables both policymakers to use and identify materials and the science community to be part of the production of new knowledge products that have been based on very strong, rigorous scientific research and analysis in different parts of the world for global policy. So there is a natural kind of synergy, and there is a very strong appetite, both in terms of the science community, but also in terms of the policy community. And we've found that over the last few years, especially through the World Migration Report, as you've mentioned, building that up in relation to making sure that you're continuously improving it, going back to users, going back to researchers in terms of what we can improve, what we can do better, listening and learning, and sometimes making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. The second role, I would say, is understanding the boundaries where they lie and respecting them, bending them, but not breaking them. And that's particularly important. And for me personally, I have had the real privilege of working in lots of different parts of the world. My partner is a diplomat, so I've been a trailing spouse. And all along the way, it's been utilising and maximising the opportunity for whatever contribution you can make at a particular point in time in different parts of the world. And so within that, I've been able to operate within the boundaries. So within policy, within diplomacy, and also very much within science. And that's been a real asset. So we often will have interns and secondees to encourage that collaboration across different sectors. We have the discrete initiatives, including because of funding, but we also have long-term initiatives within the migration research and policy environment to enable those discussions and to enable that cross-collaboration, understanding of the different systems and structures. And lastly, final point on this question is really mentoring. That's so critical, I think, for this particular type of work, to be a mentor and also be mentored by leaders. And often it can be very informal, and you can find a mentor who you don't expect. You know, you might have very significant differences demographically. You might be, miles apart in terms of age and experience, or different backgrounds in terms of whether people have worked in the UN or in governments or in different industries, even in private sector and so forth. But sometimes there's a chemistry where you can learn from each other. And there's also the opportunities for mentoring team members and peers along the way. And that's particularly important, sharing that knowledge with individuals, and with individuals who you can see a lot of potential in, and helping them along the way navigate some of the obstacles and learning from some of the mistakes that you make.
In the discussion that we had in preparing this session as well, one of the skills that a lot of people think about when it comes to spanning boundaries also that you mentioned was communications. And you shared how challenging it is to find the right level of simplicity while not being simplistic in a way. Are there, maybe there's communication, are there other sort of lessons that you've learned that are sort of widely applicable to someone getting into the science policy interface?
Yeah, I think the systemic issues are not inconsiderable. They can be quite significant, particularly in terms of terminology, and the different working methods and the systems operate quite differently. So incentive structures can be very, very different. If you're in policy, you are trying to solve problems. If things are working well, policy officers don't usually get involved. It runs like a machine and clockwork, and that's fine. The well-oiled machine is always what you're after, but you're often dealing with problems, unintended consequences of policy, or changes, very significant changes in the external environment. I mean, in the environment in which we work in, both in terms of migration and displacement, but also science policy interface, the context matters enormously. So those kind of systemic issues over the top of kind of very significant changes, and I would point to, because we're talking about global policy, geopolitics, and the geopolitical environment is highly uncertain, it's highly unstable at the moment, and of course multilateralism is at risk at the moment, of course, as we know. But if we understand the incentive structures, then it makes it easier to be able to be basically a translator in some ways. Because it was, I mean, when we were doing the kind of the pre-session discussions, I think I recalled that I hadn't really understood that I was working on, say, migrant smuggling 20 years ago, because in government you have a completely different terminology for it. You're talking about compliance and integrity of programming, and migrant smuggling is central to that. But then when you're in the research community and the global policy community, rather than national levels, you're using very, very, very different language, and that can be quite different across different geographies as well. And cultural constructs can be very important, but also very challenging. So at the global level, we can often engage in misunderstandings, and it's very useful to go back and just reconfirm and be that 3-year-old and ask why again, just to confirm that we're on the right page. And it goes straight to what Maxime was talking about in terms of trust and long-term relationships. It means that you can have those open conversations. It might not necessarily be in an open forum, but making sure that you're on the right page to be able to do that interface work is incredibly important.
And again, related to that point, you mentioned in our discussion that the role of being a boundary spanner is, I mean, there are tensions that are sort of inherently part of the job, right? It's not something you can escape easily.
And that has opportunities and it also has challenges. The opportunities means that you're always in quite a creative environment because there is a degree of uncertainty that underpins it. So it can be actually quite useful. A lot of people who are boundary spanners, I would imagine, kind of think as they're talking and as they're writing in different mediums and so forth. So having the dialogues is incredibly useful. But you have to be clear about making sure people don't cross that boundary deliberately to undermine science. That's the big issue for policymakers. So I think we talked about the time that I had been called by a very, very senior person in the Australian government, who shall remain unnamed, and he said, "Why have you cited this particular thing?" And I said, "Because we have to. We have to have credibility, and you'll see I'm looking after your interest because it's an open source. It's not a classified piece of information, so it's easily able to be, you know, digested and defended. So I'm looking after you as well as after the team of analysts and researchers. If we don't mention it, we have no credibility. No one will read our material, and we won't be able to provide accurate, robust advice to government." So there are ways of doing that, and sometimes it can be a little tricky, but you have to be clear about where the line is and helping people not cross that line.
Right. Thank you. No, I think that's very important, and I think we're starting to get a picture of the complexity of that role. Creative people, being a custodian of science, understanding the politics, understanding the boundaries without crossing them, being able to navigate them. So, yeah, I think thanks already for your illustrations and experience that sort of draw that picture. I'd like to move along to Pascal for another sharing of experience. So Professor Peduzzi is the director of UNEP GRID Geneva, which is a program of the UN Environment Program, along with the University of Geneva and the Swiss Office for the Environment. Pascal is working with a team of 20 scientists who are really focused on transforming data into useful information and knowledge to be used by decision makers working on climate-related issues. So Pascal, being the director of quite a unique entity that seems quite focused by its mission to span science policy boundaries, and also realizing the context of climate change where scientists have been raising the alarm for many years, and yet policy action has been quite disproportionate to the urgency that the scientific community has raised. Could you share some of the observations that you've had in the past few years in terms of sort of effectively working that interface between science and policy?
Well, thank you, Nicolas. Yeah, I will go back in time because there are some extraordinary examples. If I look at my inspiration, for example, Rachel Carson, she was a marine biologist and she was fascinated by birds' life, and she saw that the DDT and other pesticides were killing the insects, which in turn were reducing the birds' population. And what she did was not to talk about pesticides and complex molecule and all this kind of complexity that kill the birds. She just wrote a book called Silent Spring, and that kind of triggered the emotion to people that's, okay, it's not about pesticide and all these things, it's about not having the birds singing in spring. And that translation of science into something that people can understand in very simple words and very simple facts. You continue with pesticide, we will have no more birds. That's a very simple message, very powerful. And when she published her book in 1962, there was a tremendous response from the public, and then from the politics as well. And 10 years afterwards, in 1972, the United States decided to ban DDT. That's a very powerful, inspirational story. This one single person triggered so much passion about a field that she convinced policymakers to actually come to a ban of those pesticides. I think the reason why of this success is because she went way beyond science and not stopping at her field, but trying to communicate her passion and communicate in simple words and facts what it is. But facts are not enough. You have to trigger emotion. And also you have to go into changing policies in one thing, but as we've seen with the Paris Agreement, okay, all countries have signed. Let's go and let's stay below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5. But then we see how it turns into actions. Limited actions have been done. So the success of when I was watching live the Paris Agreement, I called my kids. I said, look, this is a historical moment. Everybody's about to sign. And of course, nothing was solved at that time. And we still haven't solved it. So it's at the end of the day, it's when you turn policy into concrete action with positive impact on the ground that matters. So that link, science to policy, if you take policies as not only the policies as a law, but policy as implementations, that's where we need to go, to policy actions on the ground, because that's, at the end of the day, that's where it matters. So that's what Wangari Maathai was saying. You can do a lot of talk, but at the end of the day, what really counts is when you dig a hole, you plant a tree, and you water it until it survives, and then you've done something. The rest is just talking. And so we have to say that discovering something like the science, and I would take another successful example, is the Montreal Protocol. It's the one we are just saying, oh, we succeed. That's right, we succeed. We may fail in many others, but that one we succeed. So scientists discovered the ozone hole. They discovered the molecule that was responsible for that. They contacted the politician and the industry. The industry had a solution to replace those CFCs. Politicians say, okay, let's go around the table. They signed the Montreal Protocol. I make it shorter. And then the CFCs were banned. And now we can start to see a plateau and increase of ozone hole and a slow recovery of the ozone hole. So that's a successful story. So it means there are many pathways to do it, but at the end of the day, you need to go to the last mile until the industry, where they used to have those CFCs and banning, making sure they got a substitute and they can do things in a different way. So it doesn't stop at the signature of the agreement. It stops where you actually have concrete impact on the ground. And so those are inspirations of successes, and then we have to remain very humble as what we can do. I mean, as one individual, I mean, we're not superheroes. We're not going to solve the world, at least not alone. So it has to do a lot about connectivity, about network, about finding allies, about understanding both the world of science and the world of the policymakers, and understand what information is needed, and not to make it too complex, like Rachel Carson was saying, silent spring, just talk to that. And what I found out is that most of my work when I started as an environmental scientist, I thought, okay, that's easy, we bring a graph or satellite imagery before, after, facts, and people will take action based on fact because we are rational beasts, right? Well, it didn't really matter. So we can say that we shouldn't cut more trees than they grow, or we shouldn't fish more fishes than they reproduce themselves. That's just common sense. But when you look around, common sense do not prevail, right? So we actually need to touch the emotion. And as a natural scientist, environmental scientist, I didn't know much about emotion. But I understood that if you want to move that road, you need to talk to emotionally to people, which is not something scientists are good at. Actually, we are good on facts, and we talk about 95% intervals of confidence and this kind of stuff, which is exactly what the policymakers do not want to hear. So when you see the room and that Maxime Stoffer showed the pictures of this room in the parliament, where you have, was it 2/3 of the people were missing? That's scary. So it's really to say, you have scientists that try to communicate, not necessarily in a very clear way sometimes. I'm not talking, some of them are really good, huh? And that's the one we decide to go outside of their lab and try to talk clearly. But some others are just really publishing in Nature and finding their own publication is what matters, and they're in their own lab. So they decide not to communicate, or to communicate with a jargon that no one understands. And on the other side, you have people who, on the whole, would much prefer not to hear anyway. So how do you reconcile those two? Those people decide not to be heard, and those ones don't want to hear. And you have to find a narrow passage. So first of all, you have to, if you want to be a scientist that can influence the policymaking, you have to talk clear, and you have to understand what matters for, what is the piece of information that they need. All the rest, you forget about it. This is for your own science, you keep it. You make it clear. To the point that it might be wrong scientifically, and not wrong in a way that you're going to say lies, I'm not saying that, but in a way that you say, yes, I'm sure about it. Yeah, I've got 95% interval, but stop talking 95% because they would say, oh, so you're not sure. So if you have your 95% interval, you say, yes, this is clearly the things. You have to make it, that's what failed with the climate change. Because they came on saying, yes, it's most likely, extremely likely, and they put those percentage of intervals, and then you have those merchants of doubt. If you haven't read that book, just read it, it's fun. They went into that narrow bridge of those 5% of the, oh, you're not very sure, you're not 100% sure. And a scientist would never say 100% sure. But you have to stick to say, yeah, I've got my 95%, yes, I'm certain about it. That's scientifically a lie, but if you're going to talk to policymakers, that's the way to do it, because it is the reality. You will never get 100% certainty. And so you have to find these discussions and the way to talk to those people, and then you have to find people who really want to add and bring them solutions. Because if you bring them only problems, it's difficult for them. They've got so many things to deal with. It's not only about climate change, about biodiversity and pollution, but it's also about education, about security, about budget, and all these things. All the lamps are red on their dashboards. And so if you come with another red light, they can say, hey guys, I've got everything full already. So, but come with a solution, you get already a better this. So that would be my first answer to that.
Thanks a lot. And I mean, on your point about the 95%, that sort of relates to my previous question on communication, simplifying things. Do you feel that the ability to sort of package the scientific knowledge into something simpler to understand is something that's easier to do precisely for someone who's more a boundary spanner than a sort of pure researcher who might have more difficulty to claim, it's 100% when it's not?
Well, you have to decide what role you want to play. And if you want to do academic research and fundamental research and publish in high-level journal, this is fine. And I think we need those guys. We need science to progress, and that's in itself is very respectable. Now, if you want to have an influence and talk to the public, well, you have to talk in a journalistic style and not with scientific jargon. Because if you choose to do, it's difficult even for consumers. They go outside in the supermarket, they go in the supermarket, they want to cook and they want to make sure that they do it right. So they're going to see all these little ingredients and it's full of chemicals, formula. They don't get it. You need to have a PhD to do your groceries to make sure you have no palm oil or no other stuff that you don't want. It's getting very difficult. So it's about making things easier for people, because if we want people to progress, you will maybe touch 10% of people really enthusiastic about something, and maybe they will make the effort to listen to your scientific talk. But if you want to talk to the big majority that will make a change, you have to lower the obstacles. And one of the obstacles is the language. And if people don't understand you, they're not going, why would they do what you say? And I mean, the first things they need to understand. So lower the obstacles and make things easier is indeed. So if you are a scientist who want to have an impact, you want to go out of your lab. And again, if you want to stay in your lab and doing fundamental science, this is perfectly right. So, but if you decide to have an influence, then you have to change your language.
Thanks a lot. Well, definitely, I think get back to that notion as well. I'd like to move on to Moira so that we stay on time. So Moira Fowle is the Executive Director of NORAG, an associated program of the Geneva Graduate Institute that develops research, facilitates policy dialogue, and builds capacity around issues of education and development. So Moira, in your career, you've navigated the science policy spectrum, so to say. You've worked in charity organizations on policy research. You've worked in the private sector. You've worked in academia as well, researching the use of evidence in policy. And now you're leading NORAG, which is an entity that, in a way, also spans science policy boundaries. So, Moira, first I wanted to ask you, with hindsight, and it's always easier to do that after the fact, but what would you say you've learned through those different professional experiences that sort of help you in your current role and help your understanding of what works to connect science to the policy issues that matter to you?
Thank you. So I think I would say probably the first thing is the fact that I have worked in so many different sectors and places means that it helps in terms of being able to communicate with people who maybe seem to be very stuck in their particular way of thinking or doing or speaking, to believe that change is actually possible. To have that optimism, I think, is absolutely critical in the kinds of roles that we are working in or we're seeking to work in. And something else that I think was very important, when I first came to Geneva 7 years ago, I had a year where I was working in the Palais des Nations, which was a year where I really had space to learn. So making sure that we're looking for those mentoring opportunities that Mary mentioned, where we're actually saying there is some learning to be done here. There's never the end of the road, and making sure we're making space for ourselves to learn, as well as supporting others to learn what it is that we may have, and making space for that learning to happen, and also how they may connect with others who may have other things to offer as well. Again, inside being on the inside of the system, know the processes and the deadlines, or find someone who does. Because if you don't actually understand some of at least part of what it is that Maxime presented there, it's very difficult to know where it is that you might be able to intervene usefully, or how it is that you actually make some of these interventions. Reputation. This is something that you can't get into a room, nor can you have your ideas taken seriously without that, and you can build your reputation in different ways and in different places. Obviously, being an associated program of the Graduate Institute gives us a reputation in a very particular space, and then we have built that reputation where, the organization is celebrating its 45th anniversary this year, so we've built that reputation into other spaces from our solid basis within the Graduate Institute. From the private sector, will maybe be surprised, do needs analysis. So this comes from sales training. You have a message that you want to put across. You know the stuff that you need to say. You can say what you want to say, but you will not be successful until you say what the other party can hear and actually take on board. And so I think even though it's something that comes from sales training and people would say that has nothing to do with anything that we're talking about, I would argue that it absolutely does. And being ready to negotiate, for sure, within boundaries, within very clear understanding of if it is that we've done a needs analysis and you're going to ask me to bend the evidence that exists, then that's not something that can possibly be done. But within the bounds of what is reasonable in terms of what it is that I bring and I offer, or my organization brings, or I have networks that I can bring, then that's something that can be negotiated, and how. And serendipity, you will meet a lot of the right people. You will meet some people who will be the right people for now, who will be interesting and useful, and you'll do something, and 10 years later, all of a sudden, that's something that's super relevant that you had no idea about. And, you know, we, as human beings, we always backcast a perfectly formed narrative, but that's not necessarily the next step in front of you. It needs to be the right step for now, but it's not necessarily going to be one that you can say makes sense going forward in the future. But you'll make sense of it in the past. And then the last thing I would say is, so I am Zimbabwean, and something that is absolutely critical to me that needs to be brought to these organizations that I'm able to bring in my position with NORAG is absolutely the place for marginalized voices, for marginalized peoples in these policy dialogues. And really what's critical in this point, at this point in time now, is we have a discourse in international circles, whether it's the European Union, in Geneva, in New York, where there are an awful lot of organizations and people talking about localization. Some go so far as to dare to say decolonization. But we need to be very, very careful that we're not simply seeing this word localization ending up being a discourse which actually is just ends up being basically the local implementation of somebody else's agenda, as opposed to what localization is being sold as, which is actually going to countries, communities, and saying, what is it that's happening here? How is it that this can be supported in order for it to be useful? And that's something that I definitely would say comes from my position as a Zimbabwean woman, to be able to say that this is something that's very important, but it's not something that only we can do. You all need to be doing the same thing and making the same cases.
Thanks a lot, Moira. And I think I mean, one of the initial takeaways I take already from the what you three described is many of the skills that you've described are not things that you've learned in curricula. These are things that you've learned on the job, as you say, as you said, through serendipity, or sort of making sense of also past skills that you've developed. You mentioned in private sector, for example, the sort of packaging of things. Marie, I know that you also had a journalistic communications background as well. Pascal, you said that you really also had to learn on the job some parts of it, also related to fundraising, creating coalitions. So I think already something that stands out is that there are clear common skills and competencies that you three highlighted, but yet these are not things that are sort of taught to people that aspire to become boundary spanners between science and policy. One question that I had for you, Moira, but also for the whole group, and then we'll also open up for your questions and comments, so be ready to raise your hands. When we think about the spectrum from science to policy, in a schematic way, it goes from knowledge production to knowledge translation, scientific advice, policy advice, and ultimately policy making. And I was wondering, in your job, and first of all with you, Moira, when do you spend yourself, when you find yourself most engaged? At which part of the process do you spend more time? Is it more early on to sort of make sure that the science fits what's happening in the policy world? Is it closer to the end stage where it's about, again, a communication of the findings, a mix of all of that? So I was wondering, where do you find yourself most busy in that sort of spectrum?
Yeah, so I think one of the fascinating and fantastic things about working as NORAG is we work all the way across the spectrum, and certainly in terms of the terminology of boundary spanner, I certainly feel that the concept that helps me a great deal is thinking about spaces between fields and working in the fuzzy boundaries, rather than necessarily saying there's a thing that's sort of separated and I need to have 1 foot in each place. It's actually saying there's this very fuzzy boundary, and what is it that we can do in this fuzzy boundary that is actually useful. And one of the things is thinking about systems approaches. Now, talking about complexity does not mean that you're going to be, sort of doing enormous sort of complex fluid mechanics or anything like that with policymakers, but being able to take a scientific process seriously to say, if we do something that's a completely linear process and we're dealing with something as complex as sustainability, something as complex as education, something as complex as human migration, then we're not necessarily going to get to the right answer. If we can take complexity seriously and support the other people around us in science to take that seriously, and then be able to support policymakers to get to the right solution, even if it's only just right for now, and that part of that solution is actually very localized and saying, how do you take the data from where you are, have a very tight feedback loop in order to make new changes. It's not necessarily about having a beautiful policy document, as you said, signed, and then what actually happens with that. And I think the critical there as well is recognizing that Western science, it's a science policy interface, it's one valid way of knowing. It's not the only valid way of knowing. And being able to, in climate change, we're talking about the Anthropocene, but really which, anthro is people, right? So this is people caused, but which people? Are we really going to seriously say that a rural African woman is the people that have brought us to the point where we are right now in terms of climate change? And therefore, are we really going to be talking about policy solutions that are about population control in Africa versus consumption control in the very place which is causing an enormous amount of the problems? And the absolute critical piece here is taking seriously the latest research on how to move evidence into policy. We talk about evidence and policy, and yet there's an enormous amount of research, and I'm very glad to see that Maxime is going to be contributing to that, about how that process actually happens. And sometimes that is something that gets lost in these discussions, frustratingly. So translating information alone, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Once you have the products, how do you actually think about the relationships? It's about people and not concepts. If you don't have those relationships and you're not building those relationships, then you're not going to be able to do the job that you're setting out for yourself. How do you support systems? How do you build systemic requirements and rewards into your own system in your institutions, and then advocate for it to funders, whether it's research funders building rewards for researchers who step outside their comfort zone and say something about the Silent Spring, or indeed policymakers to actually step outside their, I'm going to write this policy with paragraph 4C, and it's going to say this thing, and it's going to be very legalese, and actually say, well, actually, where is that coming from in terms of the research that goes into it? And really, I think very, very, very much important. Communication is something that both of my colleagues here have mentioned. It's really important to always go beyond what it is that convinced you. People who have been convinced about the facts about climate change, they have already been convinced. if we want to reach those others that have not yet been convinced, we need to find a different way to communicate. We need to find a different thing that will convince them, because it will never be the same thing that those of us who are already convinced, whether it's climate change, whether it's the importance of evidence in policy, or any other aspect of our work.
Thank you very much. And thanks for mentioning incentives as well. That's something that I'd like to get back to. Any other quick reactions from the panel on where you find spending most of your time from the science to policy spectrum, or where you think it's worth spending more time to make a difference?
Well, definitely, and that's not what I'm doing, but what we need is not stopping at policy, but stopping at actions with positive impact on the ground, and then we can measure those progress, and that would be the proof that we've been successful. But everybody's got their role, so we have people who are producing the science, people who are then transforming those data into knowledge, people who are aggregating knowledge together to explain what is going on, and people who are brokering this knowledge to in a way that is clear and simple to understand, and they understand the policy links. And then you have the policymakers who are drafting, based on this knowledge, the laws and policies that need to be incorporated into the different legislations, and then that has to be translated in action. So everybody's got their piece of work to do, and I stopped at bringing science and knowledge to, but I bring solutions as well to on the desk of the policymakers. So I go beyond a bit my work. My work should be just translating data into information and knowledge, but I go as far as proposing solutions to try to understand what can be done. And then I communicate a lot. I try I'm teaching to young, you were saying mentoring, I'm teaching at university. I'm communicating with the media, to press conference, or give conferences to the public. And then, of course, with government, which is our main, this is the real boss. It's not the UN, is not the boss. The real boss are the governments, so I'm talking to governments. And that's where I spend quite a lot of time doing these kind of things. But unfortunately, I also spend a lot of time doing administration and fundraising, so that is, if someone could do that for me, I would have more time to do the more fun stuff.
I think we're all doing the admin and the fundraising, which is, the levels are getting higher, and the workload's getting higher in terms of both of those aspects. What I started looking after, being the custodian of the World Migration Report, almost 6 years ago, and it had existed since the year 2000, but it had been turned into a kind of a thematic report which covered one topic. And so when I came in, I did a lot of informal consultations, as well as more formal, actually, review and evaluation. Doing the needs analysis that you talked about, Moira, is really important, and haven't really stopped that, because what we've found through engaging in quite heavy continuous improvement, including with donors, and having a MOPAN assessment done we've got another one about to start. That's the Multilateral Organisational Performance Assessment Network, with the big donors coming into the organisation, and looking at knowledge products, including the World Migration Report, doing evaluations, doing independent outreach with policy makers, and looking at what value add we can bring, what are the gaps, and what can we deliver that is useful for societies all around the world. And one of the things that we quickly worked out 6 years ago is moving the World Migration Report into a global reference report, rather than just a annual kind of thematic migrants in cities or migrants and well-being, but making it a global reference report, because there are no incentive structures in science, in academia, to do that. Publishing is a fast-moving, changing, very challenging environment in terms of the academic scientific publishing community, and I'm heavily engaged with a number of different publishing outlets in different scientific and policy environments, but also understanding too that especially young people, as well as policymakers, but when we work with the World Economic Forum, I often see there's so many similarities between teenagers and industry leaders. You know, they've got the kind of like the same attention span. They need to move across things really quickly. They can be very difficult to reach and communicate with. And I see them as so similar. I have 2 teenagers in the house, so I learn a lot from them. But dealing with industry leaders, they need to get very fast information that is very punchy and draws them in. Why am I interested in this? I get a zillion things a day. I need to be convinced that I should be engaging this particular topic. So to try and distill that information into something that is meaningful has meant that we have moved dramatically in the last 6 years in terms of digital tools, data visualization, an educator's toolkit, that we're working with International Baccalaureate. Always work with the best that you can. So we will be always working with the industry leaders or the best migration scholars so that we can learn from them, we can partner with them, produce a high quality product and so forth. But making sure that we're constantly checking back in terms of its utility, in terms of its reach, and we have metrics to measure that so that we can then go to MOPAN, we can go to the senior leadership team, we can go to donors. We have expanded our donor base quite dramatically out of necessity, I would say, but we've got the metrics to be able to demonstrate that. And what inspires me inspires a lot of scholars, and I would point to Ravenstein, who wrote 2 papers in the 1880s on the laws of migration in the UK. He was a geographer, but he was working on internal migration. He was motivated by someone who gave a speech who said basically it's all random and there are no laws of migration and it's all completely kind of crazy during the Industrial Revolution. And he was inspired by that, by trying to correct things. So part of the educator's toolkit is looking at a textbook that my son has been using and going, well, that's just not very good, is it? So let's do something better. Let's engage with the best in the world. Let's work with the best researchers, the best artiviz people, the people who work on award-winning platforms to work with International Baccalaureate so that we can deliver that something that is really useful, that is meaningful, and it will help people, especially young people, learn about migration so that they can then go on and be policymakers or scientists or diplomats.
Thanks, and I'll take away the notion that if you aim for a teenager attention span, you're likely to reach a wide range of stakeholders. And thanks for mentioning the different formats that science can take with the World Migration Report, the thinking you had. Obviously, I know that Pascal, your team is doing a lot of work in terms of data visualization. With the World Environmental Situation Room that provides sort of real-time climate change data. So I hope we can get back to that, but I want to give an opportunity for people also to raise questions and comments. So the floor is open. I think there was a question over there. Maybe I'll take a few at a time, but yes, please.
Thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. I'm Erna Burai. I'm a researcher here at the Graduate Institute, so I'm an academic and someone who is convinced by the importance of this creative space. My question is about the point of building a reputation and building a voice for yourself, for a position of authority, and what it has to do with institutional embeddedness. So let me just say an example. As a political scientist, I have approached our research office saying, I have an idea, I would like to get funding to offer something that is not necessarily political science, but something for the academic community. And they told me, you have 10 years of experience doing this, but you don't have a PhD in educational science, and no one will give you money. Or I wanted to do something again, like take initiative, and my mentors were actively advising me with the best intention, say, don't go for anything interdisciplinary, no one will hire you with that profile. So while I understand how important this creative space, and I appreciate that, but it seems to me that you have to be in a very conventional institutional path to be able to speak even across boundaries. So I would be very curious what you think about that, and if you have a creative solution for that, how to navigate that space. Thank you so much.
So I'm a GP and emergency physician, and it feels like I'm a boundary spanner all the time between the science and the psychology of human beings who behave differently. And I have a question to Pascal Peluzzi about this 100% communication, because I think scientists learned from this climate issue for COVID. And so it was like vaccination is 100% safe. And then they were taking exactly this. No, 100% never exists. And I was fighting for that all the time. Yeah, I know somebody who got one little thing with the vaccine. Yes, but it's still less than COVID, and it's still present now. So what's the right thing? Whatever you say.
Thanks a lot. I think we'll get answers now, and then we'll get another set of questions. Thank you. So whoever wants to
I'm happy
comment
to go with the first one. So I think the first thing I would say is if there's a question around sort of like you're being told you don't have the expertise in that thing that you want to do, find people who do and build networks and build structures and systems around you. And one of the fantastic things about research funding is actually building a team around you and building a network and a group actually gives you more, it gives you more standing. Now, academic reputations are built on a postage stamp because the idea is you need to have extremely deep knowledge in something that's fairly small. And if whoever it is, if that is the career that you want, then you accept the internal and the intrinsic and the extrinsic rewards of the career path that you have taken, or you change the career path that you take. And so it's a case of, I love research, I love writing. Those are the intrinsic rewards. I also love the policy space. I also love the outreach kind of work, which are extrinsic rewards in a different career path. So the question is then how you actually do that, or how it is that you build your reputation in this very narrow space and then find those people who are able to move that voice into the policy spaces or into those other spaces where you would like to be heard. Reputation that I was referring to, and when I said reputation, it's absolutely critical when you're actually the people who are in that fuzzy space, because fundamentally you can have rotten tomatoes thrown at you from both sides, and that happens in academia. If you use mixed methods, you'll get it from both sides. In this particular case here, with science policy interface, you can get it from both sides. So it's about knowing how to switch registers in order to maintain that reputation, and knowing where your authority comes from. Does your authority come from the fact that you are sitting in this international organization in a research post? Does it come from the fact that you're sitting in a university in a non-research post? And how do those different things play, and how do you work across those? And it's not walking a tightrope, but it is, it's about being able to switch register, know where you are, who you're with, how you actually need to work that particular room.
I wrote two things. The second one was partner with experts and collaborate, just as Maurice said. And the first one was ignore their advice and prove them wrong. I mean, all of us will have had absolute junk advice, completely, thanks very much. I really appreciate your time. It was so nice to talk to you and meet with you. Thank you very much. And then you just walk away and go, that's mad. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But you know that, and you just then treat them wrong. I've been told so many times that I can't do things because I don't have this, or I don't have that, or I don't have this. But you can. You can, and you play to your strengths and partner to minimise your weaknesses. And that's also about running a team and managing a team, knowing what you're not good at and making sure that you've got bench strength to be able to back up on various aspects around administration, around budgets. I'm not great at budgets, and have always worked with people who have real strength in those areas to sort of soften the weaknesses. And then also expand and make sure that you're rethinking and revising and making sure that you're crafting and following your own path. Not necessarily what someone has dictated to you, but you can take even bad advice is very useful, but in a strange sort of way. But yeah, we've all received bad advice. And then those people don't really become mentors. And then we do have good advice and we do have serendipity, and sometimes we don't understand that it is serendipity at the time, some very obvious ones. Like when you sit next to Kofi Annan on a plane, then you know that that's pretty lucky. So you use that opportunity and end up doing some work for him. But other times you treat everything as a potential opportunity. Everything is a potential collaboration, and it's about linking up and making sure that you're understanding the other person. So listening is super, super, super important. And then ignore.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to use your question to make a more general point, and also challenge the panel a bit, because I think we should not make the mistake to become too idealistic in how we conceive of boundary spanning, and still actually remain pragmatic. Because if we think that boundary spanning is possible, and we have this rosy and romantic view that we can actually span boundaries all the time, that is clearly not the case. So the problem, I think, with boundary spanning is that it comes not only with an added value in terms of science policy engagement, but it comes with costs. If you take a policy actor that has to read policy briefs or answers emails, every time this policy actor reads policy briefs, there are more emails, and vice versa. A scientist, every time the scientists work on journals, there are more exams to correct, and vice versa. If you add boundary spanning into the picture, you increase cost, opportunity costs of these people. And the question, I think, to the panel is, and to you as well, is, do these people need to incur the costs? Should they just actually accept that this is a cost, and by doing boundary spanning, they will do less research, maybe lower quality research potentially. They might read fewer policy briefs, and so on. These are costs. Should they decide to incur them? Can they do that? But this also brings the question of incentives and how we actually support these people. And then the question again is, should policy actors and scientists become these boundary spanners, or should we create incentives for new professions to actually exist and keep academics to do research and keep policy actors to consume research, and just create new profiles that will help both of these broadly construed set of actors actually do a better job? That's more like a question to the panel than an answer.
I validate that question. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that question, and also, Pascal, if you could get back to the question on the 100%. Maybe first that.
Okay, I think we have two. It's very interesting because it's exactly the two different settings that are appealing different part of the brains. So the climate change is a kind of slow onset hazard for which our brain is not designed to cope with, because our brain is still, and I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm fascinated by these stories, why we're not able to take decision on something that is slow onset. And so our brain is basically the same as a caveman who was confronted with danger that was very fast. So you get attacked by mammoths, you have to run and hide and then that's what we know, we can react. And COVID is these kind of things, it was very fast. So people had to take fast decision, and they did. When you look at what the level of decision that were taken for COVID, it's quite unbelievable. The borders were closed, I was able to do bicycle at peak time on the street that is usually full of cars and heavy traffic. It was unbelievable what level of decision had to be taken so quickly, because we were facing a very fast danger. Climate change is a totally different, and it's associated with other parts of our brains that is not designed to do that. It's this slow onset hazard. We don't know how to deal with it, because tomorrow will be pretty much the same as today, and it's just a gradual change that we don't see it happening. So I don't think we can compare those two things, because they are actually the decision process that is needed for climate change on this slow onset is very complex and brings a lot of thought and so on, whereas we have the immediate danger that people had to take decisions, they just have to act. But I think what we did wrong in climate change is this kind of thinking that we need 100% confidence to take action. It was not the case at all. I mean, 30 years ago, we had enough knowledge to take action. So we've just been going through this slow process, and the industry was trying, the petrol industry, the coal industry, were just trying to gain time, not to do anything. And they were just saying, oh, until science is sound, we're not moving. And they managed to push this doubt. And us scientists, we comply with it, because partly because, yes, we know that there is never 100% certitude, but also because more research is needed is always the way you conclude your articles, because more research is needed is the way you get it funded. And so it's good to say more research is needed, keep your lab going. But I think we should have been much more blunt about it. Back in the 70s, or at least in the 90s, with the first IPCC report, there was enough confidence to take action. And at that stage, we should have said, no, we don't need more science. Yeah, we always need more science as scientists, but we don't need more to take action. That's what I mean. We should have said, yes, climate change is ongoing. We need to take action. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble. We'll be in big trouble, big trouble. Let's wait more science for that. But anyway, actions need to be taken now. And I think we've been wasting 30 years on sterile debates. And even now, if we are talking to people about 1.5, 2 degree or 3 degree, this morning was what, 13 degree, and this afternoon was 28 degree. We got 15 degrees gradient for people. 15 degrees, fine. No one is dying. And so it's bad communication. We should say 1.5 degree is already bad because we're going to lose 70 to 90% of the coral reef. And it brings sea level rise of 48 centimeters. Now, 2 degrees is 56 centimeters. That's slightly worse. Now, 3 degrees is 7 meters. Now we're changing the game. 7 meters, and we're heading for 3.2. So for people, if you say 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, doesn't, and I can understand, it doesn't have translate into real meaning. Now if you say, do you prefer 48 centimeters or 7 meters? Well, I think that makes things a bit clearer, especially if you live in a low-lying area. I mean, Swiss people would just say, okay, it just gave, less time to go to the beach. But for people who live in Miami, New York, in the Netherlands, in small islands, that has immediate impacts. And I think we need to get to that level of clarity. And and this 1.5 degree, again, we are talking about 66% of chances of achieving that. Are we really willing people to get that clear, or are we just trying to make it very difficult for people to understand? For COVID, I'm not in the health science, so I can't really say about vaccinations and percentage. I would not go in this area, but what I could say is it was totally different, and I would not have been willing, must be very tough to be in the decision seat, because those decision was one day to the next. Whereas here we had for climate change, we have no excuse, because basically we had so many years to do the change, and we were not able to do that in 30 years. That's, I think, is totally disastrous. And when I see that politicians, things that know it all to the point that they don't attend an option for getting more knowledge, I think this is really, I hope people will be getting sanctioned. I guess they won't, but political sanction by people not voting for them, I don't think it's going to happen. But I think it's irresponsible. If you are in charge of a country, you get to know the best knowledge. And selecting, even some politician went as far as giving an interview saying, so taking time, so it's not that they were busy, taking time to explain to the media why they were not going to attend. I found that just absolutely amazing.
Thanks, Pascal. I just wanted to get back very briefly to the question that Max raised, and then I'll take a final round of questions. But on Max's point, okay. That means we're close to the end, probably. Do you agree with the notion that boundary spanners, or so-called boundary spanners, can in a way remove the cost of the complexity of managing science policy relationships in a way that can let scientists do science and policy actors take decisions? Do you feel that's the case? Do you think that's a function that should be more recognized, strengthened? And what type of incentives should there be, if that's a useful function, to support the work of those people? And of course, you, in a way, represent also those people. So yeah, in a way that's a sort of synthesis of the discussion that we had, but what do you think, how do you see that role of boundary spanners, and do you think that's something that's prone to grow and that would need more recognition and support?
The first university was set up in Fez, I believe, several centuries ago. And so there's been an enormously long history for this particular sort of culture, habitus, whatever we want to call it, to develop. People have been making policy decisions that have been governing other people's lives at various different levels for probably as long as there's been any sort of sense of human and group working together. So I think, you know, we need to sort of look back at it in that way, and also and not think only in terms of the way that we have come to understand the world as very atomized, and there's environment which is separate to economy, which is separate to society, that there is science which is separate to policy, that there are, you know, sort of all of these separations. These are fantastic analytical tools that we can say, I'm going to separate the world into these categories, and then it helps me to think about them. If we don't stop and then put those categories all back together and then say, actually, how does this work together? How can we make sense of this usefully in its own complexity? Then I don't think we're doing anybody any favors. So I'm going to throw the provocation back to actually say, do we need more separation, or do we actually say, here is a function that needs to happen, and there are some people who may be more comfortable in one kind of an area, some others who want to do it in other areas, and some who might want to be standing in this shifting sands, in these fuzzy borderlands. And actually, how do we incentivize all of those to work together? And how do we build the systemic requirements and the systemic rewards in to be able to make sure that happens? So where you have funders who are basically saying, we're funding research, and part of the requirements of your funding is that you will have something to do and something to say to policymakers and practitioners, that you will involve people who are the target population, to use that frame, in designing your actual project. How do we do the same thing on the policy side to actually say, you know, thank you for this research that was, you know, sort of these policies that say these things. However, how have you done community engagement? Have you done some kind of participatory budgeting process inside, or are you recommending it inside the policy that you're putting together? And how do we actually then build these roles, but not as an either or? It has to be both and, otherwise we're just fundamentally setting ourselves up to be inhuman.
Maybe I'll take the last round of questions and then let you react to my question or the ones from the room. If you can allow me 5 more minutes because we started late. So there was a question there in the back, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adrian. I'm a recent HEC Lausanne graduate, and I have a bit of a far-fetched question. But when you talked about bringing up emotion to communicate science, I immediately thought about art, which is to me is the most efficient way to communicate emotion. And we see today through music, movies, that it has a profound impact on cultural evolution. But I feel like there's this delay between the time that artists pick up the problem and they communicate it. And I was wondering if you ever considered collaborating with artists to inform artists scientifically and to create a form of science-based art that could manifest itself earlier in the process than it does now.
And we'll take another question here. Thank you.
I am not sure I understand what it is about, since I came very late and I have very bad hearing. So I have to get content with the logos at the bottom of the screen. Half a century ago, David Halberstam, a famous then US journalist, wrote a book, The Best and the Brightest. And he explained that all the failures of the US government came from the fact that they appointed the best and the brightest. And half a century before, nearly, in France, another writer wrote a book about La République des professeurs, which explained all the evils and illusion of our society by the fact that the professor had become the new ruling caste or class. So from what I have heard so far attending the start of this Science Policy Week, and what I heard from Jesda 1 or 2 years back during the launch, I wonder whether we are not witnessing a comeback of technocracy. Technocracy has known eras of glories and eras of deserved demise, and now it's coming back. It should be interesting to know why it comes back at this point of time. Now, I have an add-on to my question, suggested, inspired from the last question. What would you think if we would do the same for arts? Don't you think that it would be the obituary, the end, the death of art?
Thanks a lot for the questions. We didn't talk so much about technology in this panel, but of course, panelists are free to answer that question. I'll add one very last question that will be my last. So I'll let you guys do the synthesis of the questions that were raised. And my last question is, in essence, what would be your key advice for a young, aspiring boundary spanner in Geneva? What should that person focus on in developing their profile and aspiration? But please do also react to the questions that were raised before, if you have something to say on art or as well.
So on the relationship with art and science, absolutely. I think you're spot on. The first time I met the new executive director of UNEP, this is Inger Andersen. I'm a data guy. Huh? I'm the guy who build the data platforms to make sure that people get access to this data and into information, visualize information, so that you actually can give access to this data that if you're not a data scientist, you can't get that. So I'm trying to make it publicly available because of all these fake news and so on, that we have some data that are available to all. People say they need data. It's not true. They need information and knowledge, because raw data is not something people know what to do with it. You get raw satellite imagery, it's binary product. No one knows to do what. Well, my team knows, but not people in the general public. So that's my work. And that's how Inger Andersen saw me, the data guy. But the first time I saw her, I say, look, I've got a question. Can we organize a Wembley concert like we had in the 80s, where it was about trying to leverage funds for Africa in famine and in Ethiopia mostly. It was about Nelson Mandela and human rights in South Africa. It was about AIDS. So we had 3 big concerts organized by Bob Geldof and so many big bands. And I remember I was a teenager. Yeah, for Ethiopia, exactly. And I was shivering. I mean, I was listening to that. It was amazing. And I thought, what about if we get those big artists that were actually talking about climate or pollution or biodiversity and trying to get that message across the cultural? And why is Hollywood not making movies about climate change and how to fight about it? They're like the heroes would save the planet. And, we got that so many times, they're saving the planet against. Well, there was Don't Look Up recently. There was the other way around. They didn't save the planet. I mean, I don't want to spoil, but spoiler alert, too late. So I think we need this kind of cultural stuff, and I love it. And that's exactly what I did that's exactly what I did not in 2006 and what I did well in 2007. In 2006, I published an exhibition along the lake with satellite imagery of before and after, a forest, no more forest, a lake, no more lake, really depressing stuff. And I depressed everybody, nothing happened. So I learned from that, and then the year after, I did another exhibition at the Botanical Garden called Let's Reagir, Let's React. And then it was before, after, solution. And on top of that, I worked with the gardeners of the Botanical Garden, and it was not only my posters, but when it was about deforestation, they took some dead trees that they burned and they planted them back, and then for desertification, they put a huge dune of sand with palm trees for climate change, and on loss of biodiversity, it went from very high biodiversity to a carpet of artificial grass, and it was art. And so there was the global pictures with my satellite imagery and concrete solutions that people could do at the public level associated with art. And then we could touch emotion. Then we got people, then we got schools, then we got lots of things were happening, as opposed to my 2006 exhibition, which was factual things and like people get totally depressed. So I think, yes, this is where we need to go because that is triggering action. I was told by my colleague Tobias Baroche that if you want to get into action, you have to trigger anger and not fear, because fear people will go away, but anger gives you kind of motivation. But anger with no hope, you're just going to destroy things. Like this is the no future kind of things. But associated with hope, so with solution, then you can trigger action. And at the end of the day, what matters is not the technology or technocrats agree. What matters is the actions taken on the ground. So Wangara Maathai, she triggered those plantation of 1 million trees, and now it's become the Billion Trees campaign. So this is about planting trees. This is concrete stuff done on the ground. So I think that's what matters at the end.
And Moira, any final thoughts?
On the technocracy, I think one of the problems, if you look at politics at a national level, is actually you can see an awful lot more of creeping authoritarianism, which is anti-technocratic. And so I think there's if you're looking at national level politics, then it's absolutely not the sort of heyday and the best time for technocracy. So I don't think that that's the case. I think in international Geneva, there is still the Enlightenment ideal in action. And I think one of the problems with the Enlightenment ideal is precisely what you said, which is it is based on an assumption of rationality, which human beings have proved is incorrect. It's not that we aren't rational, but we are also emotional. We also do have a set of values. We also do have all of these other aspects to us. And what the Enlightenment did was to say that science is a thing that's really important. And it is. Totally agree with it. That policy is a thing that is very important. And that democracy is a thing that is absolutely critical. But it also told us that we just have to cut the rational and only focus on that. And that is one of the reasons why I do believe that this is why we're in some of the problems that we're in right now, where we have this, what's the word? It's a pushback against the Enlightenment, not because that everything that the Enlightenment said was incorrect, but because it has over-rationalized things. It has cut the arts, it has cut the emotions, it has cut the humanity in the service of this hyper-rational, utility-maximizing, whatever, which is fundamentally based on inhuman premises. And if your science is based on inhuman premises, if your macroeconomics that's being, sort of produced and taught in universities is based on those premises, we now have very useful heterodox economics coming out of many different universities, which are telling a very different story of how to integrate these different things about humanity, about the economy, about the environment, about society. So I think in a lot of places we're actually, I wouldn't say it's technocracy's last gasps, because it can always come back, but there are an awful lot of places where technocracy is in serious trouble. Overreach is also a problem, and we need to make sure that it is about evidence and into policy, but you have to also respect that it is about politics into policy, and it is also about the polity, and who are those who can decide, who are the polity that are making those decisions. You can't see it as a problem, that it's not just evidence-based policy. You have to respect it, and you have to see it, because climate change, we saw when the politics of climate change were pushed into science, because the politicians refused to take the politics, the democratic politics, seriously. And there were all kinds of politics that were pushed into science. There were leaked emails. There was all of these politics around the science, because there was not allowed to be a public conversation. And that's something that is deeply, deeply dangerous.
I have a slightly different take, and that is that we are in an era of opinion over analysis. The technocrats are losing the battle, most definitely, because of communications changes that have been extremely profound in the last 2 decades, the way that the telecommunications, ICT infrastructure works is so completely different, even just compared to 20 years ago. It's really changed the environment and the context in which we're working. Disinformation is a huge issue, undermining political systems, undermining the rule of law, undermining how people operate, including science, but also policy, most definitely. And this is, I think, a real challenge. With it. In the first chapter of the World Migration Report, we talk about 3 global transformations, environmental, geopolitical, and technological. And the technological changes are actually reinforcing behaviours and changes that are undermining the respect and the validity and the impact and the reach of science. So we've got to be very clear in terms of, like, you know, when we're talking about boundaries, we have to acknowledge that the boundaries are changing. The boundaries are not as they were 20 years ago. And for policymakers, the amount of data, the amount of material that they have to sift through means that we need to be curators and brokers of accurate knowledge to counter disinformation. If we know that some of the problems are in the tech and the social media space, that is inevitably where the responses and the solutions will be found. Regulators are actively, constantly, continuously turning their attention, but regulation is not enough, I don't think. We need to be engaging in education of children especially, trying to work with tech platforms, trying to work with regulators, but also looking at how, making sure that we're honest about how the environment has changed. There's been more data that has been created by humanity, like in the last 3 years compared to the previous, you know, human history. The mountains of data, the mountains of information, mainly user-generated, actually, from these, it has grown tremendously. Self-publishing of opinion over analysis is just huge, and it's not getting any smaller, it's getting bigger. It's getting more enormous and more pervasive. It's a very, very significant challenge.
Thanks, Mary. Maxime?
I'll be quick. I'm going to address the technocracy aspect as well. So I think there's a difference between, like, knowledge and technology, and like this difference is actually quite profound. For knowledge, this is basically what we're talking about in science and policy and science and diplomacy. The goal is to, like, align knowledge and action. So basically what we know about the world and what we do in this world. And naturally, these 2 things should align. And the more they align, probably the better. And there are many challenges in this. And I think we're very far from becoming overly technocratic there, because we've seen that the way information, knowledge is used is subject to political forces and worldviews. And that is a fact that we should accept and basically work with. But for the technology aspect, and based on what you heard from Jesda, I think here the problem is a little bit different. Based on what you have from Jesda, technology is a lot about, like, solutions to global challenges, which is true indeed. But technology is always like a double-edged sword. And technology also has risks. And part of, like, talking about science is also to be very self-critical and to, like, address the nuances. So if we start talking about technology, we should basically talk about technology in a way that is very nuanced and constructive and recommend solutions when they're useful, but not boost technology where it's actually risky. And that is currently something that is not discussed in this week. So it is a criticism that I think is indeed valid. So I'll end here, but happy to talk over a cocktail. A key advice for young boundaries planners, because that was one question. I am pretty young, and I think the way I got my job is to just dare asking, reach out to people. People often say yes more often than we think, and that definitely works. The second thing is, once you ask, you cannot just ask and hope they will hire you and work with you. You need to be constantly useful to them and understand their shortcuts, whether they're scientific shortcuts or policy shortcuts, and actually fit into them and be useful. So this will be my advice.
Thank you very much. And so that brings us to the end of the panel. Thank you so much. It's brought a lot of food for thought. I found it incredibly inspiring. I think it made explicit things that are very implicit in Geneva in terms of the work that people do and what it takes to do it. And you know, that's something that the GSPI wants to make more explicit and to talk about and gather people to share experiences around that. So thank you so much. Again, I think we got a good early picture of what spanning boundaries skills entail. I think it requires a thick skin, being diplomatic, but also being assertive, good communication skills, not compromising on science. So yeah, I think it's sort of drawing a picture of a type of person that gets to the job in very different ways, obviously. But that's, I think, very necessary to make that ecosystem work. So thank you so much. Really appreciate all the input that you've given us. Thank you for attending, for your good questions as well. And we have a bit of time now to talk over our cocktails that are just next door. So stick around and see you next time. Thank you.